Hi, and welcome to the Common Sensei, number 2, the dictator mindset. What does it say about us that the world is so much at the mercy of dictators and wannabe dictators? Right now, I'm appalled at the level of power being given to those dictators, power that the sensible majority seem unable to wrest themselves away from. Since my personal philosophy is always to look first for the log in my own eye, or to be the change I want to see in the world, to quote Gandhi, I thought we might take a journey through the theme of dictatorship, both big, the literal dictators, and small, the ways in which sometimes we might show up in a similar way. Now, the thing to notice about dictators is that every dictator started out as a liberator. Seriously, pick any one of them. Let's start with Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe. He led the revolutionary ZANU movement and became the country's first prime minister after independence. Then he settled in for another 30 years as a dictator who stage managed elections and called himself president. Then we could get started on Fidel Castro, and so on. We could go on forever. I'll invite you to start your own list or Google dictators and read their stories. You'll see it's the same pattern again and again. Now, of course, they don't see themselves as dictators. They continue to believe their original narrative. In their minds, they remain liberators for a lie, even while they're destroying the country. And once again, the question is, how do we allow this to happen? How do so many people fall for it? How do they manage to become and remain cult leaders to millions of people? Of course, the more useful question is, how do we unwind ourselves from this pattern? And, by the way, you get dictators in business too, in sports teams, in churches, and families. And so, in the spirit of personal responsibility, as you listen, you might want to reflect on where you might be seeing this, where you might even be doing it in your own small way, in your small corner of the world. You're probably not, but just maybe. Also, we could address this subject through a broad sociological lens or a slightly narrow behavioral one. Those would be valid, but not the journey I want to take you on. I want to approach it as a coach and ask the question that a coach would. What internal shift would our dictator have to make to transform and set themselves on a different path? Because that's what we want, isn't it? That's really what we're asking for. We want them to have a change of heart. We want them to transform. It would certainly be so much easier than having to stage a revolution with all that bombing and shooting and living in tunnels that has to happen. Besides, they're good at revolutions, our dictators. They've already proved that they know how to win them. So here goes. Let's say I was preparing for a coaching session with someone who no longer wanted to be a dictator. It has dawned on him that the liberator he once was, and by the way, in my list of dictators, they're all men, that the liberator he once was has begun to morph into the oppressor that he fought against, and before it's too late, he wants to exit from that trajectory. Now, in preparation for the session, I would speculate that at the deepest level, the insights that will most benefit him will be as follows. First, to not conflate his ego identity with the country's identity. And good luck with that, I'll tell myself and move on to the next one. Second would be to see that the struggle is over, at least to the extent that what got him to where he is will probably not get the country to where it needs to be, including, hopefully, the insight that he might not be the right person to take it forward. And third, to let go of the possibly unconscious, probably unconscious, need to be compensated for his suffering. In other words, his need to get revenge, to level the score. So let's unpack those. And once again, while we're doing it, think about where else you might be seeing this. Think about where you yourself might be doing it in your own small way. I'll try to point out some examples. First up is the issue of identity. It amazes me that this can happen, but there are people whose identity is so conflated with that of their country, their company, their team, their family, that if they can't have that thing, then in their minds, that thing can't exist. This gets tragically expressed in a murder-suicide where the father doesn't only kill himself, he sees his family as an extension of himself and so feels the right, or perhaps twisted obligation, to take them all with him. In the series Succession, We saw something like this with patriarch Logan Roy. He simply could not let the company exist as an entity separate from himself. He made a great show of deciding who he wanted to pass it on to, but he was never really going to let go as long as he was, spoiler alert, as long as he was alive. In politics, we see it in every dictator. So we ought then to pay attention when Donald Trump treats every legal threat to him as a threat to American democracy, as though he and America are one and the same. An additional factor is that our dictator's identity as a founder or liberator, as a veritable savior, means they can never admit that they are the problem or the ones doing wrong. That founder, savior, liberator identity is a tremendously powerful force, and one that even the most sophisticated societies seem susceptible to, even in this day and age. We can probably say the same for almost every tech billionaire. When they start out, they present themselves as modern saviors until, through the dependence they create on their technology, they become just like those hegemonic dictators. They refuse to admit that any problem occurring on Earth could possibly be their fault, and God forbid anybody should try to regulate them. No, like true dictators, they insist on regulating themselves, which means not at all, or superficially at best. If we bring this down to our own lives, we can see the way in which we become identified with our careers, our roles as boss, as sports team coach, as pastor, chairperson, parent, and how we treat it as though something happening to the business or the team, the family, the child is really happening to me, and how reactive we become in fighting against that, how we become mini dictators in our little corner of the world. Is it really true that it's all about you? So next we come to the issue of how dictators hold on long after they've lost relevance. How for them the enemy remains the enemy that was defeated, even decades after the battle was won. Mugabe, we mentioned earlier, actively attacked colonialism as the enemy more than 4 decades after Zimbabwe gained independence. Apartheid is still the enemy for the ANC liberators of South Africa, nearly 30 years after that system's demise. For Americans who hold America to ransom over the Second Amendment, the federal government is still their enemy. Apart from the self-aggrandizement that this applies, such holding on to the past is the opposite of vision and being visionary. And by the way, if any dictator does have a positive vision for their country and executes on it, they're termed benevolent dictators. And so the exception proves the rule. And it's no wonder then that dictators take their country backwards. If you look at North Korea under Kim Jong-un, is still trapped in the 50s. Cuba, for all its romanticism, got stuck in a similar era under Fidel Castro. In his research into what makes companies truly outstanding, the Good to Great author Jim Collins discovered that the leaders of those consistently great companies were usually ones who operated not as indispensable heroes, but as quiet guides who made themselves redundant by empowering those around them. They were able to retire without any noticeable disruption to the business. If we look at Nelson Mandela, ironically, the one person whom people would probably have welcomed as a ruler for decades, stood down after only 1 term as president. Once again, the exception proves the rule. I reckon countries would be better served if our dictators erected a statue, named an airport after themselves, and retired to a villa by the sea after they completed 1 victory lap. Once again, bringing this into our own lives, in what way do we still fight wars that have long been won or even lost? I can think of one that comes up a lot. When we want our children to know how much we suffer, when we insist that they must learn the lessons we did by fighting the same enemy we fought. Or as a business leader, we defend against something that happened a decade ago, insisting that we'll never let that happen again, not recognizing that things have changed. That enemy is gone and will probably not come back. But if we don't look out, we won't see the one that does come. And socially, politically, religiously, we can really get stuck in the past, fighting to maintain the relevance of laws or interpretations from some other age. And so third, there is the issue of compensation, of getting your own back, getting revenge. leveling the score. Our dictators seem to have an insatiable need to be compensated for what they suffered, as though that might somehow level the score. For the past 2 decades in South Africa, among the political elite, there has been a saying that it's our turn to eat. They want to make up for what they missed out on in the past, and they feel it's their right. The consequence has been that large portions of taxpayer money have still not been adequately spent on services for the people who suffered under apartheid. To that extent, those leaders have turned into the very thing they fought against. Of course, the pattern is easy to deny because the details look different. It's no longer a race thing. But for them to behave differently, they would need to let go of that notion, which would mean letting go of their need to level the score. Nelson Mandela is revered precisely for his ability to do that. He had a white finance minister and argued for the rugby team to keep their Springbok emblem. If Mandela's protégés had continued to follow his example, they would have let go of the need for compensation and forged a different path. They would have looked after future generations instead of their own. It's ironic that lawyers instructed by this South African bunch took the fight to Israel in the International Court of Justice last week to challenge Israel on their actions in Gaza. Israel's actions are deeply driven by revenge and getting even. Getting more than even, if you do the math. America, too, is big on getting even. Just ask Afghanistan and Iraq. And so is Donald Trump, who has been quoted as saying, "I don't get angry, or I don't get too angry, I get even." So perhaps the two deserve each other. But back to my point. If my client wants to not become the dictator that he sees himself becoming, then he needs to come to terms with his loss. As much as he might want to, as much as he might feel he deserves it, he has to let go of the past, except as a reminder of what not to become. And he has to become something else. And now for the check-in. Where do you see this around you and in yourself? Where might you be seeking compensation for something you have suffered? In what way might that pursuit turn you into that person that oppressed you? We really are big on getting even, no matter if it's something as small as a perceived insult. It's probably one of the hardest things to not do. Thank you. If you found value in this, please remember to subscribe and join me on Substack, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.